Back then, the Atlantic was our hunting ground, cold, merciless, and infinite. It stretched from the gray shores of Europe to the steel-blue coasts of America, and somewhere in between, thousands of merchant ships carried everything that kept Britain alive: fuel, food, guns, men. And we were sent to starve them. The German U-boats, die grauen Wölfe, the gray wolves. I was a young officer then, barely 23, serving aboard U-96, one of Dönitz's proud pack. We believed we were the sharpest teeth of the Reich, silent predators gliding beneath the surface. The ocean was our home, our coffin, and our pride. We sailed from Saint-Nazaire with laughter and brass bands, women waving white scarves on the docks, the scent of diesel and salt thick in the air. We believed in the glory of it all, of sinking ships, of returning with the Iron Cross, of being heroes in a war of shadows. But the sea, she doesn't keep promises. By late 1942, the Atlantic began to change. The air patrols grew thicker. The convoys seemed to know we were coming. They would turn, scatter, and suddenly, out of nowhere, depth charges would fall, exploding with a thunder that shook the hull and your soul together. We used to joke that the British must have hired Neptune himself to hunt us. But jokes turned to whispers, and whispers turned to fear. Entire U-boat crews vanished, swallowed not by storms, but by something unseen. U-213, gone. U-502, gone. U-97, gone. The Admiralty said it was chance, bad weather, maybe a lucky escort destroyer. But we knew better. We had seen the pattern. Boats were being hunted the same way we once hunted convoys. And every week the sea grew emptier of friends. Then one morning orders came down from Kiel. We were to report to Rechlin for testing and debrief. It was strange. Rechlin was for aircraft, not submarines. When we arrived, I saw something I'll never forget. A Wellington bomber, torn open like a gutted fish, resting on wooden blocks inside a hangar. Around it, engineers in gray coats buzzed like bees, taking measurements, wiring strange instruments. And there on a workbench, surrounded by men in naval caps and scientists in spectacles, sat a small metal box, painted black, its face covered with dials and knobs. And above it, someone had chalked the words "Radar Device, Boute England." Radar device, English capture. The Admiral himself, Karl Dönitz, was there that day. He stood with his hands behind his back, eyes narrowed, listening to an engineer named Professor Goertz explain in dry, precise tones what the device could do. The room fell silent as he spoke. Meine Herren, this is not radio, not communication. It is reflection. The English are using waves, microwaves, invisible, to detect our boats. They can see metal, even through night and fog. There was a moment of disbelief. Someone laughed nervously. "Nonsense," said a commander. "We dive 50 meters under. How could they see us?" The professor adjusted his glasses, turned a dial, and pointed to a glowing green screen that flickered with moving dots. Because, Herr Kapitän, they don't need to see you, they can find you. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked out into the cold hangar where the British bomber sat like some dead creature of another world. I stared at that black box, the radar set, and wondered how many of my comrades it had already killed. Somewhere out there, in the dark Atlantic, aircraft equipped with these very eyes of the night were sweeping the waves, detecting periscopes, snorkels, even the faintest trace of a U-boat surfacing to breathe. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was science, cold, relentless, invisible. And for the first time I realized we were no longer hunters, we were prey. But the Admiralty didn't want to believe it. Pride runs deep in the veins of men who wear medals. They said the English must have only a few of these machines, that they were primitive, unreliable. Countermeasures will come, they told us. We are developing radar detectors, new coatings, stealth techniques. Yet every week, more subs failed to return. Lorient's pens echoed emptier. The women on the docks stopped waving, and when the band played, it sounded hollow. The war beneath the waves was no longer silent, it was desperate. We began to hear strange stories. U-boats that surfaced at night, only to be attacked instantly by aircraft they never saw coming. Planes appearing out of fog, dropping flares that turned the ocean white as day, then unleashing fire. Men said the Allies had ghosts, invisible watchers that could see through darkness itself. In mess halls and radio rooms, sailors whispered the same question. How? How could they know exactly where we were every time we surfaced to charge batteries? It wasn't until early 1943 that the final clue arrived. An intact British radar set, salvaged from a downed short Sunderland flying boat off the French coast. This time, the engineers took it apart piece by piece, and what they discovered would shatter every illusion we had left about the war we thought we were fighting. You see, when we looked through that glowing green screen, when we realized what those tiny pulses meant, it was as if we were staring into the future, a future we could not stop. A week after we arrived at Rechlin, the tests began. The hangar buzzed with a tension thicker than the diesel smoke that hung in the air. The British radar set, the air-to-surface vessel Mark II, they called it, had been fully restored. Its cables ran like veins across the concrete floor, connected to generators humming with a steady, ominous pulse. Admiral Dönitz himself had returned from Paris, along with a group of naval scientists from Telefunken and Siemens. The mood was electric, but beneath it fear whispered quietly, like the hum of that machine. I stood near the back as Professor Goertz, the same man who'd first explained the concept, turned to the gathered officers. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but grave, "the English have learned to make the darkness their ally. What you are about to see is why our U-boats are dying." Then he flipped a switch. The room dimmed. The radar screen glowed to life, an eerie green circle, sweeping slowly, again and again, like the heartbeat of the ocean itself. For a moment, nothing. Then, tiny blips appeared, faint points of light. "Those," the professor said, "are reflections. The device is detecting metallic objects at a distance of 15 kilometers. If that were the open sea, those would be our submarines." A low murmur spread through the crowd. One of the officers, a burly man from the U-boat arm, shook his head. "But this is impossible. A periscope head is only a few centimeters wide. How could they detect it?" The professor turned toward him, his face pale in the green glow. "Because, Herr Kapitän, the waves do not need to see the periscope itself, only the disturbance it causes in the air and the sea. This technology makes the invisible visible." It was as if the world had tilted. For years we had believed in invisibility, the ocean as our shield, the night as our cloak. But in that moment we realized both had been taken from us. Dernet said nothing at first. He simply stared at the radar screen, hands clasped behind his back, jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his words were low and cold. "We are fighting an enemy we cannot see, who can see us perfectly." He turned to his adjutant. "We need countermeasures immediately. Tell Telefunken to develop a receiver that can detect when our boats are being illuminated." That order would give birth to what we later called Metox, a crude, boxy detector that warned us when British radar signals were nearby. But back then, it was only an idea, one faint hope against an invisible hunter. Over the next few weeks, the captured radar was tested day and night. They mounted it on a truck and drove it to the airfield's edge, aiming it across the lake, measuring how far it could see. They even placed metal barrels and submarine periscope mock-ups in the water, watching as the radar's green eye found them, pulse after pulse. It was terrifyingly precise. Even at low power, it could detect objects from miles away. Now imagine this device mounted beneath the belly of a patrol bomber, flying hundreds of kilometers across the Atlantic, sweeping for reflections. Every time a U-boat surfaces to charge batteries, it shines like a lighthouse in the night. The admirals looked at each other, silent. They finally understood why so many boats were vanishing without a trace. It wasn't bad luck, it was science, and the Allies were years ahead. Soon, word spread through the ranks. In the canteens, in the barracks, men began to whisper about the Eye. Some said the English had demons guiding their planes. Others believed there were spies leaking positions. But those of us who had seen that glowing green screen knew the truth. The Allies had found a way to turn the very air into a weapon. I remember walking along the test site one night, frost crunching under my boots. The engineers had left the radar running, its antenna slowly rotating, casting invisible waves into the dark. Each sweep made a faint clicking sound, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. I imagined those waves stretching out over the cold Atlantic, bouncing off steel hulls, reaching deep into the world of the gray wolves who still believed they were unseen. It sent chills down my spine. By January 1943, the first Metox detectors began arriving at the bases in France. They were crude boxes with headphones and a small dial. When Allied radar waves were detected, they emitted a faint, rhythmic beeping, a ghostly sound that meant death was near. We fitted them onto our boats, believing we had finally regained the upper hand. "Now we can hear them before they see us," said my captain. But what none of us knew then was that the Allies were already one step ahead. They had developed a new radar, operating at shorter wavelengths our Metox couldn't detect. So while our crews sailed with false confidence, the enemy could still see us perfectly, invisible eyes staring down from the clouds. One night, during a patrol in the Bay of Biscay, I heard it for the first time. We were surfacing to recharge batteries when a faint beeping came through the headphones. Metox had picked something up. The captain ordered a dive immediately. Seconds later, explosions rocked the water above us. The hull shook, lights flickered, men were thrown from their bunks. We'd been spotted, barely in time. When it was over, we surfaced again, shaken but alive. The captain stared into the night sky, whispering, "They always know where we are." That's when the truth began to sink in. We weren't fighting ships or planes anymore. We were fighting a technology that turned the whole ocean into a trap. At Rechlin, the tests continued, becoming desperate. German scientists tried everything: new coatings, snorkels, radio silence tactics, but nothing could hide a submarine from radar. One night, during a private briefing, Admiral Donitz slammed his fist on the table. "Our men are dying because the enemy sees what should be unseen. We must find a way to disappear again." But deep down, even he knew it was hopeless. The war of the machines had begun, and it was one Germany could no longer control. By spring of 1943, the tone in the U-boat pens had changed. There was no more talk of victory, only survival. Every mission felt like a suicide run. We would leave port knowing that somewhere out there an unseen enemy was already waiting. The green eye had found us, and it would not blink. You could feel it in the air, the end of the U-boat age. The silence of the deep no longer belonged to us. It belonged to the radar. By the summer of 1943, the Atlantic had turned against us. The sea that once protected our U-boats had become a killing field, alive with invisible eyes and iron wings. We used to say the ocean had moods. Sometimes she was calm, sometimes cruel, But now she was no longer ours at all. The radar had claimed her. Every night patrol, every surfacing, every breath we took above the water carried risk. Allied aircraft, Liberators, Wellingtons, Catalinas prowled the skies, sweeping the waves with invisible fingers of energy. The moment our periscope or snorkel broke the surface, the waves reflected back to their glowing green screens, and they came for us like vultures. We dived deep, silent as the grave, hearts pounding, praying the ocean would hide us. But even from below we could feel the vibration of their propellers, hear the sonar pings echoing through the hull. The U-boat pens in Lorient and Saint-Nazaire were no longer places of triumph. They were tombs waiting to be sealed. Crews drank more, laughed less, and counted survival by the number of patrols endured, not victories achieved. We all knew the truth, but never dared speak it aloud. Our invincibility was a myth shattered by the cold precision of Allied science. At Rechlin and Kiel, the engineers worked day and night, their laboratories echoing with the hum of machines and the nervous clatter of typewriters. They tested everything: rubberized coatings to absorb radar waves, snorkels that allowed us to run diesel engines while submerged, false periscope heads made of wood. Nothing worked. The Allies' new radar operated at shorter wavelengths, centimeter bands, invisible to our detectors. The Metox, once our symbol of hope, now betrayed us. It emitted weak signals the enemy could home in on. Donitz ordered it discontinued, and the crews went to sea blind once again. In desperation, scientists introduced a device called Naxos, designed to pick up the new Allied frequencies, but it was fragile, unreliable, and arrived too late. The hunters had already closed in. I remember one meeting in Kiel, late at night, when Donitz himself arrived unexpectedly. He stood before a wall map dotted with red pins, each marking a U-boat lost. His face looked older than I'd ever seen it. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "the wolf pack is dying. We need a miracle." But there were no miracles left, only technology. And in that race, we were already years behind. Meanwhile, the Allies unveiled yet another terror: the Lee light, a blinding searchlight mounted on patrol aircraft, used to illuminate U-boats caught at radar at night. The first time we saw it, we thought the heavens had opened, a sudden beam of white light searing through the darkness, turning the black Atlantic into day. And then bombs, machine guns, fire. It was over in seconds. No warning, no escape. Men screamed as the light burned through the conning tower windows, blinding them before the sea swallowed their cries. Survivors spoke of it like a curse, a heavenly judgment. "The angel of death has a light now," one sailor said, trembling. We began surfacing only in storms, when radar signals were scattered by rain and wind. But even that offered little safety. The enemy's technology adapted faster than we could breathe. In the shipyards, engineers worked on new designs, streamlined Type 21 submarines that could stay submerged for days, with better batteries and radar-absorbent paint. They were magnificent on paper, but paper does not win wars. Only a handful were completed before the war's end, too late to turn the tide. For those of us still fighting in the Atlantic, the end came slowly, cruelly. Convoy escorts no longer feared us. They hunted us for sport. Radar, sonar, aircraft, and code-breaking combined into a net from which no wolf escaped. Each patrol began with hope and ended in silence. Sometimes we'd receive a garbled distress call from a comrade, depth charges, damaged, taking water, and then nothing. The sea swallowed them whole. Every night the radio crackled with fewer voices. The wolf pack had been reduced to scattered ghosts. I remember one patrol off the Azores. We had surfaced to transmit a report. Radio silence damned. The captain wanted Berlin to know what was happening. I stood beside him on the conning tower, watching the phosphorescent waves break against the hull. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, "even when it kills us." Moments later, the Metox headphones began to hiss, faintly, then scream, "Radar." The captain didn't hesitate. "Crash dive." The boat groaned as we slid beneath the surface, but we were too slow. The first explosion tore open the aft compartment. The second snuffed out the lights. Water rushed in, black and freezing. I remember the captain gripping my shoulder, shouting something I never heard. When I woke, I was in the North Sea, half dead, rescued by a North Sea trawler. I was one of only 7 survivors. The rest went down with the ship. After that, I never sailed again. I was reassigned to a testing unit in Kiel, helping analyze Allied technology. One day, they brought in a captured American radar from a Liberator bomber, more advanced than anything we'd seen before. Its power was staggering. It could detect a submarine periscope from miles away, even in heavy seas. I watched as the engineers demonstrated it, the same green circle sweeping across the screen, the same flickering dots of light. And in those dots I saw the ghosts of every comrade I'd lost. The technology was not evil. It was simply progress, ruthless, unstoppable progress. The admirals held meetings, drafted reports, spoke of new tactics, new devices, but it was too late. The tide had turned irreversibly. By late 1944, our U-boats were no longer weapons of terror. They were coffins of steel. Out of every 10 that sailed, 8 never returned. And those that did came back haunted, their crews pale, eyes hollow, souls broken. The Kriegsmarine had entered the war as predators of the deep and ended it as relics of a dying dream. The radar, the silent, invisible enemy, had changed everything. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a revelation. That the age of stealth and luck was over, and the age of science had begun. When the war finally ended, I walked through the ruins of Kiel and saw our once proud submarines lying half-submerged in the mud, their hulls rusting, their conning towers scarred by shrapnel. Children played on them, not knowing what monsters they once were.
And as I watched the gray waves roll in, I realized something profound. We had been fighting blind against an enemy we could never understand. Not the British, not the Americans, but the future itself. The radar didn't just see through the night, it saw through us.
By 1945, the ocean had fallen silent. Not the silence of victory, but the silence of extinction. The U-boats, once called the wolves of the Atlantic, were now bones scattered across the seabed. What began as Dönitz's proud Rudel tactic, the wolf pack strategy that terrorized convoys, had ended in smoke and salt. The Allies had learned to see everything. The radar, the sonar, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, all threads in a vast, invisible net that caught every secret, every ship, every man. We didn't know it then, but while we were struggling to understand the eye in the sky, the British had already broken our Enigma codes. Every signal, every coordinate, every cry for help intercepted, translated, and fed straight into the Allied command. Between radar from the air and cryptography on land, our invisibility was gone long before we knew it. And yet the order came: fight to the last boat. It was madness, but pride dies slower than men. We built new submarines, new coatings, new detectors, Naxos, Tunis, Wanza, all desperate attempts to outpace an enemy that no longer fought with steel, but with mathematics and magnetrons. I remember my final days in Kiel vividly. The once bustling harbor lay in ruins, smoldering under the shadow of Allied bombers. Half-sunk U-boats littered the docks like carcasses of sea beasts. Crews stood in silence, watching their vessels bleed oil into the gray water. No more speeches, no more songs, no more illusions of victory. The air smelled of diesel and defeat. Dönitz had moved his command to Flensburg, still issuing orders as if faith could change physics. "A few more weeks," he said. "New tactics, new boats. We can still turn the tide." But there was no tide left to turn. The Atlantic had chosen its side. The new Type 21 submarines, sleek and fast, promised a new era, able to remain submerged for days, almost invisible even to radar. But they came too late. Only a handful were completed before Germany itself began to crumble. When the British forces entered Kiel, I was ordered to assist with the surrender of equipment and documents. I stood beside a table stacked with files stamped Geheime Kommandosache, top secret, while across from me Allied officers examined them quietly. One of them, a British radar specialist with kind, tired eyes, picked up a small black box, the Metox detector we had once trusted with our lives. He turned it over in his hands and smiled faintly. "This one helped us find you," he said softly. "It emitted signals we could trace. We didn't even have to use radar sometimes." I didn't answer. What could I say? We had believed we were clever.
using science to cheat death, and yet it was our own device that betrayed us. The irony cut deeper than any torpedo ever could.
Later that day, I was taken to a warehouse where captured German technology was being catalogued. There, under the cold flicker of lamps, stood rows of radar sets, ours and theirs, side by side. The Allied models were smaller, cleaner, and frighteningly advanced. One of them was an American H2X radar, compact, deadly precise, able to map the ground and sea from thousands of meters above. I watched an Allied technician demonstrate it, the beam sweeping across a model landscape, revealing every object in perfect detail. "This," he said, "is why your boats vanished." It wasn't arrogance, but just truth. Cold, unarguable truth. I stood there, staring at the glowing green line, feeling the weight of years crash upon me. All our courage, all our faith, all our sacrifice, undone by a pulse of invisible light. In the weeks that followed, I worked with the Allied engineers under supervision, helping them identify equipment, translating manuals, explaining German terms. One day I found myself standing beside an American officer who had served in anti-submarine operations. He looked at me, not with hatred, but with a kind of weary respect. "You know," he said, "our boys used to call your submarines iron coffins. We thought you were fanatics, but now, seeing this," he gestured toward the wrecked equipment around us, "you were fighting ghosts." I nodded slowly. "No," I said, "we were fighting the future." He didn't reply, but he understood. In the evenings, when the work was done, I would walk down to the harbor. The sea was calm now, too calm. The same waters that once echoed with explosions and dying men now reflected the peaceful glow of sunset. I would see the broken periscopes rising from the shallows like gravestones of a forgotten age. Somewhere beneath those waves lay thousands of sailors, friends, enemies, brothers, all bound by the same cold fate. And above them, the radar waves still swept silently through the air, invisible and eternal. The war had taught me something no book ever could, that courage without understanding is just another way to die. We had faith, discipline, and steel, but they had science, and in the end, that made all the difference. When I left Kiel for the last time, I carried nothing with me but a small piece of metal, the knob from that first British radar set we examined in 1942. I keep it still. It reminds me of the moment the world changed, when the night stopped being our friend, when the unseen became the most powerful weapon of all. And sometimes, when I stand near the sea and hear the wind hum through the rusted hulks of those iron coffins, I swear I can still hear it, that faint, rhythmic pulse, the heartbeat of the machine that saw us all. Years passed, but the sound of that radar pulse never left me. It became a kind of phantom heartbeat, steady, distant, eternal. Long after the guns went silent and the flags changed, its rhythm still echoed in my mind, reminding me of how quickly the world can outgrow the men who built it. I returned to the sea often, not as a sailor, but as a wanderer, searching for something that no longer existed. The U-boat pens in Lorient were overgrown with moss, their concrete walls cracked by time. Children played where once we loaded torpedoes. Fishermen cast nets where once convoys were hunted. The world had moved on, but the ghosts of the Atlantic had not. Sometimes, when the fog rolled in and the water turned to steel, I could almost hear them. The rumble of diesel engines, the creak of pressure hulls, the distant laughter of young men who thought they were invincible. And then, beneath it all, the faint hum of radar, the invisible light that had seen them all. That was the cruel poetry of it. The weapon that killed us left no wound, no flame, no sound. Just a signal bouncing through the dark, marking a target that never knew it was seen. I once believed war was fought by courage and will, by steel and fire. But I learned that in the end, wars are decided by those who can see farther, by those who turn the unseen into power. The Allies did not outfight us, they outthought us. While we clung to pride, they built machines that could pierce the night, decode our secrets, and map the invisible. It wasn't luck that won them the sea. It was vision. Years later, in 1958, I was invited to England for a scientific exhibition in London. I went reluctantly, but when I entered the hall and saw it, the same radar dish that had once hunted us, polished and mounted as a museum piece, I froze. A young British technician noticed me staring and said, "That one helped save thousands of lives." I nodded, and for the first time I understood both sides of that truth. It had destroyed us, yes, but it had also protected others, convoys, sailors, families waiting at home. The same technology that doomed our submarines had preserved the light of a free world. And perhaps I thought, that was the price history demands, for some to vanish so others may survive. I walked closer, reached out and touched the cold metal. It was smooth, almost gentle, and I whispered to it, quietly so no one could hear. You were the better weapon. When I left the museum, rain was falling softly. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement, and for a moment I saw reflections that looked like radar echoes dancing at my feet. The world had entered a new age, the age of electronics, of invisible power. What radar began had become everything. Computers, satellites, missiles.
The invisible had become the new battlefield, and humanity would never again be blind. I smiled sadly, realizing that we, the U-boat men of the old Atlantic, had merely been the first casualties of a war that never truly ended. A war between visibility and invisibility, between what man can see and what he cannot. Now, as an old man, I sometimes return to the cliffs above Kiel and watch the gray horizon melt into the sea. The radar stations are gone, the towers dismantled, but in the wind I still hear their hum. It's faint, almost like the heartbeat of the ocean itself. The sea remembers everything, the courage, the fear, the triumph, the loss. And maybe that's how it should be. Because history isn't just written in books or stone. It's written in echoes, in signals, in the quiet spaces between what was seen and what was never meant to be. So, if you ever stand by the ocean on a calm night and feel the world humming faintly beneath the waves, remember this story. Remember the men who sailed believing they were invisible, and the machine that proved them wrong. If you liked this story, the rise and fall of the German U-boats, and how a captured radar set changed the war forever, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell for more untold stories of history's forgotten machines, moments, and men. Because in every whisper of the past, there's a story waiting to be heard.